Sometimes we convince ourselves that love has passed us by, that we're too old, too worn, or too set in our ways for such tender mercies. We tell ourselves that acceptance of solitude is wisdom, when perhaps it's just fear dressed in practical clothes. Astrid, a widow in her coastal village, has made peace with cooking for one and talking only to the gulls. When a giant Viking warrior named Halrik arrives seeking food and shelter, she speaks her truth. "I am too fat to love, sir, but I can cook." But as winter storms pass and he keeps returning, they discover something beautiful in their quiet routines. This is the story of two people who thought their hearts had grown too old to surprise them. Can love find us, even when we've stopped looking for it? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like a familiar shawl as Astrid stepped from her cottage door, breathing in the salt-tinged air that had greeted her for 63 years. The wooden bucket in her weathered hands had made this same journey to the well countless times, first as a young bride beside Magnus, then as a mother with children trailing behind her skirts, and now for the past 8 years alone. Her cottage sat perched on a gentle rise overlooking the harbour, close enough to hear the fishermen calling to each other in the pre-dawn darkness, far enough to maintain the privacy she'd grown to cherish. The stone walls, thick enough to withstand the fierce coastal storms, held within them the accumulated warmth of decades of cooking fires and the lingering scent of herbs that hung in bundles from the rafters. Inside, her kitchen stood as the heart of her world. The great oak table, scarred by years of kneading and chopping, dominated the center of the room. Copper pots hung from iron hooks, each one positioned exactly where her hands expected to find them in the dark hours before dawn when she began her daily bread. The massive hearth, built by Magnus's own hands during their first winter together, could accommodate 3 large cauldrons and still have room for the bread ovens built into its sides. On the mantel above the fire sat her most treasured possession, a leather-bound recipe book, its pages yellowed with age and splattered with the evidence of countless meals. Her mother had given it to her on her wedding day, and her grandmother had given it to her mother before that. The recipes within weren't merely instructions for preparing food. They were the accumulated wisdom of generations of women who had nourished their families through harsh winters, lean times, and celebrations alike. "Bread is more than flour and water," her mother had told her, pressing the book into her young hands. "It's love made tangible, comfort you can hold, hope that rises with the yeast." Astrid had carried those words through 40 years of marriage, through the lean fishing seasons when Magnus came home empty-handed, through the bitter winters when the fjord froze solid and no ships could reach their village. The village of Skergård nestled against the rocky coastline like a collection of weathered shells, its wooden houses painted in the traditional blues and reds that had faded to gentle pastels under the constant assault of sea spray and Arctic winds. 200 souls called it home, bound together by the rhythm of the fishing seasons and the shared understanding that survival depended on looking after one another. Astrid's role in this community had evolved naturally over the years. What began as sharing extra loaves with neighbors had grown into something more profound. Young mothers sought her advice on feeding growing children when the fish weren't running. Old fishermen stopped by her kitchen when their wives had passed, drawn by the promise of a warm meal and conversation that didn't demand more than they could give. Travelers, rare as they were, knew they could find shelter and sustenance at Astrid's table if they approached with respect and honesty. She had learned early in her widowhood that purpose could be found in service to others, that meaning didn't require grand gestures, but could be discovered in the simple act of setting another place at the table. Her dining room, with its long wooden table and mismatched chairs collected over the years, had become an unofficial gathering place for the village's lonely souls. The morning ritual of bread-making began before the sun touched the eastern mountains. Astrid would rise in the darkness, build up the fire from the previous night's embers, and begin the meditation of mixing, kneading, and shaping that had become as essential to her as breathing. The rhythm of her hands, working the dough, served as a form of prayer, a way of centering herself for the day ahead. Today, as she worked the bread dough, her mind wandered to the dreams that had been visiting her lately. Strange dreams, filled with the sound of heavy footsteps on her wooden floors and the warmth of another presence sharing her hearth. She pushed the thoughts away, focusing instead on the familiar texture of the dough beneath her palms. At 63, Astrid had made her peace with solitude. Her body, once sturdy and capable of bearing 3 children and keeping pace with Magnus through long days of work, had settled into a comfortable roundness that she neither fought nor celebrated. Her hair, now silver-white, she kept braided and pinned in the same style she'd worn since girlhood. Her hands, marked by years of kitchen work and garden tending, remained strong and sure. She had loved Magnus with the deep, abiding love that grows between two people who have weathered life's storms together. They had buried 2 children in infancy, celebrating the survival of their daughter Ingrid, who now lived 3 villages north with her own family. Magnus had been her anchor, her steady presence, the one who could make her laugh even when the world seemed determined to break them. His death had come suddenly, a heart that simply stopped beating one winter morning as he sat by the fire mending nets. No warning, no lingering illness, just the merciful swiftness of a life well lived, coming to its natural end. The grief had nearly crushed her, but the village had rallied around her, offering the same care and sustenance she had provided to others over the years. In the 8 years since Magnus's passing, Astrid had discovered that solitude and loneliness were not the same thing. Solitude could be chosen, embraced, even cherished. It was the peace of an evening spent reading by the fire, the satisfaction of a perfect loaf emerging from the oven, the quiet joy of watching the seasons change from her kitchen window. Loneliness, on the other hand, crept in during the small, unguarded moments when she automatically set 2 places at the table, when she heard a joke that Magnus would have appreciated, when she woke in the deep hours of the night and reached across the bed, only to find cold sheets. She had convinced herself that these moments of loneliness were simply the price of having loved deeply, that contentment lay in accepting what life had given her rather than mourning what it had taken away. At her age, she reasoned, the notion of romantic love was both impractical and undignified. Better to find fulfillment in the roles she could still play: the village cook, the keeper of recipes, the woman whose door was always open to those in need of nourishment. The morning progressed with its familiar rhythm: bread in the oven, porridge bubbling on the fire, yesterday's stew reheated for the fishermen who would stop by on their way to the boats. Old Halrik knocked as the sun crested the mountains, bringing fresh milk from his cow in exchange for the honey cakes Astrid baked specially for his arthritic joints. Storm coming. 1. Arthritic joints, he announced, settling his ancient bones into the chair by her fire. Feel it in my knees. Astrid glanced out the window at the deceptively calm waters of the fjord. Henrik's knees had predicted weather more accurately than any sailor's wisdom for the 60 years she'd known him. If he sensed a storm, one was coming. How long do we have? She asked, automatically calculating how much bread she should bake, how much stew she should prepare. Storms meant hungry fishermen staying ashore, worried wives needing comfort food, children restless from being kept indoors. Tonight, maybe tomorrow morning. Big one, I think. The kind that changes things. Astrid felt a peculiar shiver run down her spine at his words, though she couldn't say why. Storms were a part of coastal life, as natural and expected as the tides. Yet something in Henrik's manner, the way he gazed out at the water with his weathered eyes, suggested this storm might indeed be different. As the day wore on, other villagers confirmed Henrik's prediction. Clouds gathered on the western horizon, and the seabirds that usually wheeled and cried above the harbour flew inland, seeking shelter in the pine forests that crowned the surrounding hills. The air grew heavy with the particular stillness that preceded Arctic storms, and the older residents began the time-honored preparations, securing boats, checking food stores, ensuring that the vulnerable members of the community had adequate shelter and fuel. Astrid spent the afternoon in a frenzy of cooking, her kitchen filling with the aromas of baking bread, simmering stews, and the fruit preserves she'd been saving for just such an occasion. Whatever this storm brought, her neighbours would face it with full bellies and warm hearts. As evening fell and the first fat snowflakes began to drift past her windows, Astrid felt a strange sense of anticipation building in her chest. It wasn't anxiety about the storm, she'd weathered worse and knew her cottage could withstand whatever nature sent their way. It was something else, a feeling she couldn't quite name, as if the approaching tempest was carrying more than wind and snow. She prepared her evening meal for one, as she had every night for 8 years, setting her single place at the great oak table and filling her bowl with the same stew she'd shared with half the village throughout the day. Outside, the wind began to howl, and the snow fell harder, transforming the familiar landscape into something wild and otherworldly. Little did Astrid know that this storm would indeed change everything, bringing to her door a presence that would challenge every assumption she'd made about the shape of her remaining years. As she banked the fire and prepared for sleep, she whispered a small prayer of gratitude for the day's blessings and asked for protection for all the souls riding out the storm. The wind answered with a roar that shook the very foundations of her cottage, and somewhere in its voice she thought she heard the echo of approaching footsteps. The storm struck with a fury that surpassed even Henrik's weathered predictions. By midnight, the wind howled like a living thing, rattling the shutters and sending snow spiraling in great white curtains across the fjord. Astrid lay in her bed, listening to the familiar creaks and groans of her cottage as it weathered the tempest, when a sound cut through the storm's roar, 3 heavy, deliberate knocks on her front door. She sat up in the darkness, her heart racing. No one ventured out in weather like this unless driven by desperate need. The knocks came again, patient but insistent, and Astrid threw her woolen robe over her nightgown and padded barefoot across the cold floor. "Who calls on such a night?" she asked through the thick oak door, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. "A traveller seeking shelter, good woman. I mean no harm." The voice that answered was deep and measured, with the careful pronunciation of someone speaking a language not quite his own. Astrid hesitated, her hand on the iron latch. Every instinct, born of 63 years of life, warned her to be cautious. Yet something in the stranger's tone, a weariness that spoke of long travel and genuine need, moved her to compassion. She opened the door, and her breath caught in her throat. The man who stood in her doorway was enormous, not merely tall, though he towered nearly 2 feet above her own modest height, but built on a scale that seemed to belong to the old stories her grandmother used to tell. His shoulders filled the doorframe, and beneath a heavy woolen cloak dark with melted snow, she could see the solid breadth of a warrior's build. Yet it was his face that held her attention, weathered and scarred, yes, but with gentle blue eyes that regarded her with an almost shy courtesy. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, stepping back as if to make himself less imposing. "I would not trouble you but the storm. No traveller should face such weather alone." Astrid interrupted, stepping aside to let him enter. "Come in, before we both freeze in the doorway." He had to duck to clear the lintel, and once inside, his presence seemed to fill her cottage in a way that had nothing to do with his considerable size. Snow clung to his dark hair and the heavy cloak that hung nearly to his boots. When he straightened to his full height, the top of his head nearly touched the rafters. "I am called Halrik," he said, unfastening his cloak with movements that suggested careful restraint of great strength. "I am bound north to the settlement at Tromsø, but the storm has made travel impossible." "I am Astrid," she replied, automatically moving toward the hearth to build up the fire. "You are welcome to shelter here until the storm passes." As the flames caught and cast dancing shadows across the room, she got her first clear look at her unexpected guest. Halrik appeared to be perhaps 10 years her junior, though the lines around his eyes and the silver threading his dark hair spoke of a life that had aged him beyond his years. His clothes, while well-made and practical, showed the wear of long travel. Most striking were his hands, large enough to span a shield, yet marked with small scars that spoke of careful work rather than merely battle. "You live alone?" he asked, glancing around the cottage with the trained eye of someone accustomed to assessing new situations. Astrid felt a moment of self-consciousness, suddenly aware of how her nighttime appearance must look to this imposing stranger. Her silver hair hung in a loose braid over one shoulder, and her woolen robe, while modest and warm, emphasized the comfortable roundness of her figure that decades of her own cooking had cultivated. "I am a widow these 8 years," she said simply. "This cottage has sheltered me well enough." Something shifted in Halrik's expression, a recognition, perhaps, of shared loss. "I am sorry for your bereavement. A home such as this speaks of long happiness." The unexpected gentleness in his voice caught her off guard. She busied herself with practical matters, hanging his damp cloak by the fire and moving toward the kitchen to prepare something warm for him to drink. "You must be hungry," she said, grateful for the familiar rhythm of hospitality. "I have stew from this evening and bread." "I would not impose." "Nonsense." Astrid was already ladling stew into a bowl, slicing thick pieces of the morning's bread. "No one goes hungry at my table, especially not someone who has traveled far in such weather." As she worked, she became acutely aware of his presence behind her. Not threatening, there was nothing in his manner that suggested danger, but overwhelming in its sheer physicality. When had she last shared her kitchen with someone whose presence changed the very air of the room? She set the bowl before him at her oak table and watched as he bowed his head in what appeared to be a moment of grateful prayer before eating. His movements were careful, controlled, as if he were constantly aware of his own strength and the potential for causing inadvertent damage. "This is excellent," he said after several spoonfuls. "You have a gift for cooking." The simple compliment warmed her more than it should have. "It is no great skill. I have had many years to practice." "Skill can be learned," Halrik replied, meeting her eyes across the table. "Gift is something different. This food has been prepared with care, with—" he paused, searching for the right word, "with love." Astrid felt heat rise in her cheeks and turned away to busy herself with tidying the kitchen. Love. When had anyone spoken of her cooking in such terms? Magnus had appreciated her efforts, certainly, but after 40 years of marriage, her meals had become simply part of the expected rhythm of their days. "You speak our language well for a traveler," she said, seeking safer conversational ground. "I have traded in these waters for many years. A man learns to make himself understood if he wishes to eat well and sleep warm." There was something in his tone that suggested more to the story, but Astrid didn't press. She had learned long ago that travelers carried their own burdens, and it was not her place to demand their secrets in exchange for hospitality. As Halrik finished his meal, the storm raged on outside, showing no signs of abating. Astrid found herself studying his profile in the firelight, noting the way his massive frame seemed somehow diminished by weariness. Whatever drove him north through such weather, it was more than simple commerce. "I fear I must impose upon your kindness for the night," he said, looking toward the windows, where snow continued to swirl in the darkness. "To travel in this would be folly." Of course. Astrid realized she should have thought of sleeping arrangements sooner. Her cottage had but one bedchamber, where she slept, and this main room with its great hearth. "I can make a pallet by the fire. It will be warm enough." "I am accustomed to rough sleeping," Halrik interrupted. "I would not have you trouble yourself further." As she gathered blankets and pillows, arranging them near the hearth, Astrid became increasingly aware of the strangeness of the situation. Here she was, a widow of respectable years, providing overnight shelter to a man she had met mere hours ago. Yet something about Halrik's quiet dignity, his careful courtesy, made her feel safe rather than threatened. "I must seem foolish to you," she said suddenly, the words emerging before she could stop them. "A woman of my age," and she gestured vaguely at herself, appearance, living alone, cooking for one. Halrik looked up from where he was arranging his makeshift bed, his expression serious. "Why would you seem foolish?" The question caught her off guard. "I am too fat to love, sir," she said with a self-deprecating laugh that didn't quite hide the pain beneath the words. "But I can cook." The silence that followed stretched long enough for Astrid to regret her words. She had meant them lightly, a way of acknowledging what she saw as obvious truth while deflecting any pity. Instead, they hung in the air between them like an accusation. When Halrik finally spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. "I have traveled far and seen much, good woman. I have learned that love has little to do with what the eye sees and much to do with what the heart recognizes. Your home speaks of a woman worthy of great respect." The unexpected response left Astrid speechless. She busied herself with final preparations for the night, banking the fire and ensuring Halrik had everything he needed for comfort. When she finally bid him good night and retreated to her bedchamber, her mind churned with questions and feelings she had thought long buried. As she lay in her bed, listening to the storm and the quiet sounds of another person breathing in her cottage, Astrid stared at the ceiling and wondered what tomorrow would bring. For the first time in 8 years, she was not alone in her home. The knowledge should have unsettled her more than it did. Instead, she found herself hoping the storm would last through the morning. Astrid woke to unfamiliar sounds, the quiet movements of someone trying not to disturb her sleep, the soft crackling of a fire that had been carefully tended through the night. For a moment, suspended between dream and waking, she forgot about her unexpected guest and wondered if Magnus had somehow returned to their morning rituals. Reality settled around her as she heard the gentle clink of pottery and remembered Halrik, the storm. The way he had looked at her when she spoke those foolish words about being too fat to love, as if she had said something that genuinely puzzled him. She dressed quickly in her everyday kirtle and apron, braided her hair with the same efficiency she had practiced for decades, and emerged from her bedchamber to find her cottage transformed. The fire burned brightly, casting warm light across surfaces that had been dusted and tidied. The scent of fresh bread filled the air, and she could see that her guest had not only tended the fire, but had somehow managed to bake using her own stores. Halrik stood with his back to her, his massive frame bent over something at her work table. When he turned, she saw that he held Magnus's old fishing net, the one that had hung half-mended in the corner for 8 years. Gathering dust and serving as a constant reminder of tasks left unfinished when death came calling. "Forgive me," he said, immediately setting down the net. "I woke early and thought to make myself useful. I should not have presumed—" "No," Astrid said quickly, surprised by the tightness in her throat. "No, I've been meaning to finish that for years. Magnus was working on it when—" He paused, gathering herself. "It was kind of you to tend it." Halrik's large hands had made remarkable progress on the intricate work. The nets that had frustrated her with their complex patterns seemed to yield easily to his patient attention. She moved closer, studying his technique. "You know this work well," she observed. "A man learns many skills when he travels the trading routes. Fishermen are often willing to share their knowledge in exchange for news from other ports." He set the net aside carefully. "I also took the liberty of preparing morning bread. I hope I have not overstepped." The bread was perfectly formed, golden and fragrant, clearly the work of someone who understood the mysterious alchemy of yeast and flour and heat. Astrid found herself both impressed and oddly unsettled. In her 8 years of solitude, she had grown accustomed to being the one who provided care, who anticipated needs, who created comfort for others. Having someone tend to her needs felt foreign and strangely intimate. "You have many skills for a trader," she said, busying herself with preparing their morning meal. "The sea teaches a man to be useful in many ways, or he does not survive long upon it." They shared breakfast in a companionable quiet that surprised her. Astrid had grown so accustomed to eating alone that she had forgotten the particular pleasure of sharing a meal with someone who appreciated both the food and the silence between conversations. Halrik ate with the same careful attention he brought to everything else, and she found herself watching the way his large hands handled her delicate pottery with unexpected gentleness. Outside, the storm had blown itself out during the night, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. The fjord lay calm and silver-bright under the morning sun, and the village below showed signs of stirring as people emerged to assess the storm's damage. "The weather has cleared for your journey," Astrid said, though the words felt heavier than they should have. Halrik looked toward the windows, then back at her. "Yes, I should be able to continue north this morning." Neither of them moved to begin preparations for his departure. "Will you?" Astrid began, then stopped herself. What had she been about to ask? If he would stay longer? If he would remember her cottage when he reached his destination? If he would think kindly of the foolish widow who had offered him shelter? "Will I what?" he asked gently. "Will you take some bread for your journey? The road north is long, and there are few settlements between here and Tromsø." Relief flickered across his features, as if he too had been reluctant to discuss his leaving. "That would be most generous." As Astrid wrapped several loaves in cloth, she found herself stealing glances at him. In the bright morning light, she could see details that had been hidden by shadow and firelight the night before. The careful way he moved suggested old injuries, healed but not forgotten. There were scars on his hands and forearms, visible now that he had rolled up his sleeves to work on the nets. Most telling were his eyes, blue as the deep fjord, but carrying depths that spoke of loss and long solitude. "You have been traveling long?" she asked. "Longer than I care to count. Sometimes it seems I have been on the road more years than I spent in any one place." "That sounds lonely." He considered this, absently running one finger along a knot in Magnus's fishing net. "I had not thought of it as lonely before. It was simply necessary. But yes, perhaps it has been lonely." The admission hung between them, honest and unexpectedly vulnerable. Astrid found herself wanting to ask what made such constant travel necessary, what kept a man like Halrik from finding a place to call home. Instead, she focused on practical preparations for his departure. When his few belongings were gathered and the bread secured in his pack, they stood together by her door. The morning sun streamed through the windows, highlighting the comfortable disorder of a cottage where two people had shared space, however briefly. "Thank you," Halrik said, and she could hear genuine gratitude in his voice. "Your kindness will not be forgotten." "Safe travels," she replied, opening the door to let in the crisp morning air. "May you find what you seek in the north." He paused in the doorway, his bulk blocking the light. "And if I should pass this way again?" The question sent an unexpected flutter through her chest. "You would be welcome," she said simply. After he left, Astrid stood in her doorway, watching his figure grow smaller as he climbed the path that led away from the village. She remained there long after he disappeared over the ridge, until the cold finally drove her back inside. The cottage felt different now, not empty, exactly, but somehow diminished. The silence that had been her companion for 8 years now felt heavy and oppressive. She found herself listening for sounds that would not come, looking toward corners where his presence had briefly taken root. She tried to return to her normal routines, but everything felt slightly off-kilter. The bread she baked seemed too much for one person. The stew she prepared felt elaborate for a solitary meal. Even her favorite chair by the fire seemed to face the wrong direction. By afternoon, when Ingrid Hansen stopped by to check on her after the storm, Astrid's mood had grown as grey as the clouds gathering over the fjord. "You seem troubled," Ingrid observed, settling into the chair across from Astrid with the familiarity of long friendship. "The storm did no damage?" "No damage," Astrid confirmed. "I had a guest, a traveller seeking shelter from the storm." Ingrid's eyebrows rose with interest. "A guest? How unusual. Was he decent? Safe?" "Very much so, he was," Astrid paused, searching for words that would not reveal too much of what she was feeling. He was kind, helpful. He mended Magnus's old fishing net. The one that's been hanging in your corner for 8 years? The very one. Ingrid studied her friend's face with the shrewd eyes of a woman who had known her for decades. And now he has gone north, and you are sitting here looking as if you've lost something precious. The observation was too accurate for comfort. Astrid rose abruptly, moving to tend a fire that needed no tending. Don't be foolish. He was merely a stranger seeking shelter, nothing more. But even as she spoke the words, she knew they weren't entirely true. Something had shifted in her carefully ordered world, and she wasn't certain she could shift it back. 3 weeks passed before Astrid admitted to herself that she was listening for footsteps on her path. Every morning when she stepped outside to gather water, her eyes would drift north toward the ridge where Halrik had disappeared. Every evening, as she prepared her solitary meal, she would find herself setting 2 places at the table before catching herself and removing the extra bowl with a mixture of embarrassment and longing. The village had settled back into its familiar rhythms after the storm, but Astrid found herself restless in ways she couldn't quite explain. Her bread, which had always brought her satisfaction, now seemed mechanical. Her daily conversations with neighbors felt hollow, lacking some essential element she couldn't name. It was old Halrik who first spotted the approaching figure on a crisp morning in late autumn. "That's a big one coming down the northern path," he announced, settling his arthritic bones into his usual chair by Astrid's fire. "Same size as your storm guest, near as I can tell." Astrid's hands stilled on the bread dough she was kneading, her heart suddenly racing. "You're imagining things," she said, but her voice sounded strained even to her own ears. "These old eyes may be cloudy, but they're not blind. He's carrying something looks like a pack, walking steady, like a man who knows where he's headed." Despite herself, Astrid moved to the window. There, descending the familiar path with the same measured stride she remembered, was Halrik. Even at a distance, his massive frame was unmistakable. Her breath caught in her throat, and she pressed one flowery hand to her chest, as if to calm her racing heart. "Well, I'll be," Halrik chuckled, watching her reaction with shrewd eyes. "Seems your storm guest has found reason to return." Astrid forced herself to return to her bread, though her hands trembled slightly as she shaped the loaves. He mentioned he might pass this way again. "Traders often follow the same routes." Halrik said, clearly unconvinced by her casual tone. "And I suppose that's why you've been baking enough bread for half the village these past weeks." Before Astrid could formulate a response, the familiar 3 knocks sounded on her door. She wiped her hands on her apron, smoothed her hair, and told herself sternly that the flutter in her stomach was merely surprise, nothing more. Halrik stood in her doorway, looking travel-worn, but somehow more solid than her memories had painted him. His blue eyes held the same gentle courtesy she remembered, but there was something new in his expression, a warmth that seemed directed specifically at her. "Good morning, Astrid," he said, and the sound of her name in his deep voice sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. "I hope I do not intrude." "Not at all," she managed, stepping aside to let him enter. "You are always welcome here." Halrik made a show of examining Halrik with open curiosity. "So you're the fellow who's had our Astrid, so Halrik was just leaving?" Astrid interrupted quickly, shooting her friend a warning. "Look, weren't you, Halrik?" The old man chuckled, rising from his chair with exaggerated creakiness. "Indeed I was. Nice to meet you properly, stranger. Take care of our Astrid." After Halrik left and Enrik left, awkward silence settled between them. Astrid found herself acutely aware of Halrik's presence, the way he seemed to fill the cottage not just with his physical bulk, but with something else, an energy, a warmth that had been missing during his absence. "Your business in Tromsø went well?" she asked, falling back on safe conversation. "Well enough." He set down his pack, and she noticed he moved with the careful precision of someone who was consciously choosing to stay. "I found myself thinking of this place during my travels. Of your kindness. It was nothing more than common hospitality, Was it? He studied her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed. I have received hospitality in many places, Astrid. What you offered was something different. She turned away, busying herself with the bread that had been forgotten during his arrival. You must be hungry. I have fresh bread and yesterday's stew. I brought something for you, he said quietly. Astrid looked back to see him withdrawing something from his pack, a wooden spoon, carved from what appeared to be birch wood. The craftsmanship was exquisite, with a perfectly balanced handle and a bowl shaped to fit comfortably in the hand. I made it during the long evenings in Tromsø, he said, offering it to her. I thought of you cooking, and it seemed you should have something made specifically for your hands. The spoon was warm from being carried close to his body, and as Astrid ran her fingers along its smooth surface, she could see the care that had gone into its making. Every curve had been considered, every surface polished to a lustrous finish. It's beautiful, she breathed, and meant it. But why? Because you deserve beautiful things, he said simply. Because you are not what you said you were that first night. The reference to her self-deprecating words made heat rise in her cheeks. I spoke foolishly. You spoke as someone who has forgotten her own worth. Halrik stepped closer, his voice gentle but firm. In Tromsø, I met many people, merchants and sailors, wives and daughters. None of them had what you have. And what is that? She asked, unable to keep a note of skepticism from her voice. Peace, grace, the ability to make a stranger feel welcomed and valued, a home that feels like sanctuary. He paused, seeming to search for words. I have been traveling for many years, Astrid. I had forgotten what home could feel like until I sat at your table. The words hung between them, heavy with implications that neither seemed quite ready to acknowledge. Astrid clutched the wooden spoon, feeling its weight and warmth as proof that she had not imagined the connection she thought she'd felt. How long will you stay this time? She asked. I have no immediate destination. If you would permit it, I thought perhaps a few days. I could help with preparations for winter. I noticed your roof could use attention, and there are other repairs. Yes, she said quickly, before she could lose her courage. Yes, you may stay. The smile that transformed his weathered features was like sunrise after a long night. Thank you. As they settled into the rhythm of shared space once again, Astrid found herself marveling at how naturally he fit into her cottage, her routines, her life. The awkwardness she had expected never materialized. Instead, there was a comfortable synchronicity, as if they had been sharing space for years rather than hours. That evening, as she prepared their meal with the beautiful spoon he had carved for her, Astrid caught herself humming something she hadn't done since Magnus's death. The sound startled her into stillness, but when she looked up, she found Halrik watching her with an expression of such gentle contentment that she felt her heart skip. Perhaps, she thought, some gifts came disguised as storms. As autumn deepened into the approach of winter, Halrik's presence in Astrid's cottage became as natural as the rhythm of the tides. He had been staying for 2 weeks now, and what had begun as temporary shelter had evolved into something neither of them had quite named. They moved around each other with an ease that surprised them both, he anticipating her need for firewood before she asked, she setting his place at the table without conscious thought. The village had taken notice, of course. In a community of 200 souls, the extended presence of a stranger was bound to generate conversation. But rather than the disapproval Astrid had feared, she found herself receiving knowing smiles from the women and respectful nods from the men who stopped by for their daily bread. He's a good worker, Erik the fisherman had pronounced after watching Halrik help repair storm damage to the harbour, knows his way around boats and nets. Doesn't talk much, but when he does, it's worth hearing. Old Henrik had been even more direct. Best thing that's happened to you since Magnus passed, he'd declared one morning. Man treats you like you're something precious. About time someone did. The comment had lodged itself in Astrid's mind, returning at odd moments to make her cheeks warm. Did Halrik truly see her that way? When she caught her reflection in her mother's old mirror, she saw the same woman she'd always been, silver-haired, round-figured, marked by 63 years of living. Yet when Halrik looked at her, something in his eyes suggested he saw someone quite different. Their days had developed a comfortable pattern. Halrik would rise before dawn to tend the fire and check the cottage for any repairs needed. Astrid would begin her bread-making, and they would share breakfast as the sun rose over the fjord. During the day, he would work on the various projects that needed attention, strengthening the roof against winter storms, reinforcing the chicken coop, splitting wood for the long, cold months ahead. She would cook, tend her small garden, and welcome the neighbors who continued to seek her kitchen's warmth. But it was the evenings that had become most precious to her. After the day's work was done, and their simple supper shared, they would sit by the fire and talk. Halrik proved to be a thoughtful conversationalist, sharing stories of his travels without boasting, asking about her life and the village's history with genuine interest. It was during one such evening that Astrid found herself speaking of things she had not shared with anyone since Magnus's death. "I was 17 when we married," she said, working on a piece of mending while Halrik continued the intricate work on Magnus's fishing nets. "So young, I barely knew my own mind. My parents had arranged the match, and I was terrified Magnus would find me lacking." "And did he?" Halrik asked quietly, not looking up from his work. "Quite the opposite. He was patient with my fears, gentle with my inexperience. He taught me that marriage could be a friendship as well as a duty." She paused, remembering. "We grew into love rather than falling into it." It was perhaps slower than the passionate romances in the old stories, but it was steady, reliable. "Steady love is not lesser love," Halrik observed. "No, it isn't. Though I sometimes wondered." She stopped herself, surprised by what she had been about to admit. "Wondered what?" Astrid set down her mending, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "Whether I was capable of inspiring the other kind, the kind that makes men write poetry or risk their lives for a woman's favor." Halrik's hands stilled on the net. When he looked up, his blue eyes held an intensity that made her breath catch. "You think yourself incapable of inspiring passion?" The direct question flustered her. "I am a practical woman, Halrik. I cook well, I keep a good house, I was a faithful wife and mother. But I have never been the kind of woman who turns heads or quickens hearts." He set the net aside entirely now, giving her his full attention. "May I tell you what I see when I look at you?" Astrid felt her heart racing, but she nodded. "I see a woman who creates beauty without thinking about it, who feeds people not just bread and stew, but comfort and belonging. I see strength that has weathered grief without becoming bitter, kindness that asks nothing in return." His voice grew softer. "I see hands that know how to heal, eyes that see the good in people, a heart generous enough to welcome a stranger into her sanctuary." The words hung between them like a gift she was afraid to accept. "You speak kindly, but I speak truthfully." He leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Astrid, in all my travels, I have never met a woman more worthy of devotion." The intensity of his gaze, the sincerity in his voice, overwhelmed her. She rose abruptly, moving to the window where she could compose herself without his penetrating stare. Outside, the first snowflakes of winter were beginning to fall, and she watched them swirl in the lamplight. "You don't know me," she said finally. "Not really. You see only what I choose to show you." She heard him rise, felt his presence behind her, though he maintained a careful distance. "Then show me more." The simple request undid her. She turned to face him, and in his eyes she saw something that made her knees weak, not just kindness or friendship, but desire. Real, unmistakable desire, directed at her. "I am afraid," she whispered. "Of what?" "Of believing you, of hoping for something that cannot be." She gestured helplessly at herself. "Look at me, Halrik. Truly look. I am past my prime, set in my ways, comfortable in my solitude. What could a man like you want with someone like me?" He moved closer then, stopping just within arm's reach. "Someone like you," he repeated softly. "You mean someone who makes me feel more at peace than I have in 20 years. Someone whose smile brightens my day and whose laughter makes me remember what joy sounds like. Someone who has given me a reason to stop wandering." His words hit her like physical blows, each one dismantling another piece of her carefully constructed defenses. "You speak of stopping," she said shakily, "but you have always been a traveler. What happens when the wanderlust returns?" For a moment, uncertainty flickered across his features, and Astrid felt her heart sink. Then he reached into the leather pouch at his belt and withdrew something small, a simple ring of braided silver. "This was my mother's," he said quietly. "The only thing of value I have carried with me through all my travels. I had thought," he paused, seeming to gather courage, "I had thought to give it to a woman who could see past the scars and the wandering to the man who wants nothing more than to build a life worth staying for." Astrid stared at the ring, her mind reeling. "Halrik, I am not asking for an answer now," he said quickly. "I know this is sudden, perhaps presumptuous, but I want you to know my intentions are honorable. I want you to understand that when I look at you, I see not just a woman worthy of devotion, but the woman I want to spend my remaining years learning to deserve." The room fell silent except for the crackling of the fire and the soft whisper of snow against the windows. Astrid felt as though she stood at the edge of a precipice, with safety behind her and an unknown future stretching ahead. Everything she had believed about herself, about her life, about the shape of her remaining years, hung in the balance. The storm that arrived 3 days after Halrik's declaration was fierce enough to keep them confined to the cottage for nearly a week. What might have been awkward, the forced intimacy, the unresolved tension of his proposal hanging between them instead, became a time of deepening understanding and quiet revelation. On the second morning, Astrid woke to find one of her cottage windows had been damaged by the driving, wind and sleet. The wooden frame had warped, allowing cold air and moisture to seep through the gaps. She stood before it with a sinking heart, calculating the cost of repair and wondering how she would manage until the storm passed. "It can be fixed," Halrik said quietly from behind her. He had approached so silently she hadn't heard him, but his presence no longer startled her as it once had. "The wood is old," she replied, running her fingers along the damaged frame. "It may not hold. Trust me." The simple words carried more weight than they should have. Trust me, not just with the window, but with her fears, her heart, her carefully guarded future. She watched as he examined the damage with the thoroughness of someone who understood both wood and weather. For the next 2 days, she observed him work. His massive hands, which could have easily destroyed the delicate frame, instead coaxed the warped wood back into alignment with infinite patience. He reinforced weak points without disturbing the window's character, sealed gaps with a mixture of pine pitch and oakum that would flex with the changing seasons. "Where did you learn such skills?" she asked one afternoon, bringing him warm cider as he worked. "A man who travels learns to fix what breaks, or he finds himself sleeping cold and wet." He accepted the cup gratefully, his fingers brushing hers in the exchange. "But my father was a shipwright. I learned precision from him before I learned to wander." "You speak of him fondly." Halrik's expression grew thoughtful. "He was a good man who died too young. He would have liked you, I think. He believed that the most important skill a man could possess was knowing how to create shelter for those he loved." The words sent warmth through her that had nothing to do with the cider. "And your mother?" "Died, bringing me into the world. I have only stories of her, but they paint a picture of someone gentle and strong." He glanced at the silver ring he had shown her, which now rested on the kitchen table where he had left it after her lack of response. "She would have understood my choice to stop wandering." That evening, as the storm raged outside and the repaired window held firm against the assault, Astrid found herself studying Halrik as he worked once again on Magnus's fishing nets. The massive warrior who had appeared at her door was revealing layers she had never suspected the craftsman, the son who carried his mother's memory, the man who spoke of shelter and home with such longing. "Tell me about your travels," she said suddenly. "What drove you to leave your father's trade and take to the roads?" Halrik's hands stilled on the net. For a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried old pain, grief at first. "My father died when I was barely 20, and I could not bear to stay in the place where everything reminded me of him. I sold his workshop, took ship with traders, told myself I was seeking adventure. And later, it became easier to keep moving than to risk putting down roots again. When you have lost the people who anchor you, staying in one place becomes difficult. There are too many quiet moments to remember what you no longer have." Astrid understood that kind of loneliness intimately. "Yet you stayed here, with me." He looked up then, his blue eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Because for the first time in 20 years, I found someone worth the risk of staying." The confession hung between them like a bridge she could choose to cross or leave untraversed. Outside, the wind howled and the snow continued to fall, but inside the cottage, wrapped in firelight and honest words, Astrid felt safer than she had in years. "I have been afraid," she admitted, "not just of you, but of myself, of the feelings you stir in me." "What feelings?" he asked gently. She set down her own mending, her hands trembling slightly. "Hope, desire, the terrifying possibility that my life is not over, that there might be chapters yet unwritten." She met his gaze. "You make me feel young again, Halrik, and that frightens me because I am not young. I am a woman of 63 years who has grown comfortable with solitude. Age is not the absence of possibility," he said quietly. "It is the wisdom to recognize what matters most. And what matters most to you. This," he gestured around the cottage, encompassing not just the physical space but the warmth they had created together. "Home, belonging, the chance to build something lasting with someone who sees my true self and chooses to welcome it." That night, as the storm continued to rage, Astrid lay awake listening to Halrik's quiet breathing from his place by the fire. The cottage felt different with him in it, not just occupied, but alive in a way it hadn't been since Magnus's death. She found herself imagining what it would be like to wake every morning to the sound of another person moving through her kitchen, to share not just meals but dreams and worries and the small intimacies of daily life. The next morning, she woke to find him sitting at her table, the silver ring in his palm, his expression uncertain. "I fear I have presumed too much," he said without preamble. "Perhaps I should continue my journey when the storm passes. Find some other—" "No." The word came out more forcefully than she had intended. "No, don't go." Relief flooded his features. "Astrid, I cannot give you an answer about the ring," she said quickly. "Not yet. There are things you don't know about me, about my life, but I can ask you to stay while I find the courage to tell you." He nodded solemnly. "I will stay as long as you will have me." As if in response to their words, the storm began to calm outside. But inside the cottage, where a damaged window now stood strong against the weather, and two lonely hearts had found unexpected shelter in each other, the real healing was just beginning. That afternoon, when Halrik went out to check on the village and ensure their neighbors had weathered the storm safely, Astrid stood before her small mirror and tried to see herself through his eyes. The woman who looked back was still silver-haired and round-figured, still marked by the years of her life. But there was something new in her expression, a softness around her eyes, a lift to her chin that spoke of possibility reawakening. Perhaps, she thought, it was time to stop hiding from hope. The morning brought unexpected visitors to Skjergård. Astrid was in her kitchen, preparing the day's bread with the smooth rhythm that had become second nature, when young Thorstein burst through her door without his usual courtesy of knocking. "Mistress Astrid," he gasped, his face flushed from running. "There are strangers at the harbour, fine folk, by their clothes and their ship. They're asking for—" He paused, glancing toward where Halrik sat, mending nets by the fire. They're asking for someone called Halrik Eriksson. The bone-handled knife Astrid had been using to score her bread loaves clattered to the table. Halrik's hands had gone completely still on the nets, and when she looked at him, she saw something she had never seen before in his gentle eyes: fear. Eriksson, she repeated slowly. The name carried weight in these northern lands. The Eriksson clan was minor nobility, wealthy traders with holdings from Bergen to the Arctic settlements. Halrik? He rose slowly, setting aside Magnus's nets with careful precision. I should go to them. Wait. Astrid moved between him and the door, her heart racing with sudden dread. Who are they? What do they want? For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he reached into his travel pack and withdrew something she had never seen before, a small carved pendant of white bone, intricately decorated with Norse runes and bound with silver wire. It was clearly valuable, clearly significant, and clearly not the possession of a simple traveling trader. This is who I am, he said quietly, holding the pendant out for her to see. Halrik Eriksson, second son of Erik the shipwright. My family holds trading contracts from the king himself. The words hit her like physical blows. You lied to me. I never lied. I simply did not tell you everything. The same thing, she said sharply, backing away from him. You let me believe you were a common trader, a wanderer with no ties. You let me... She stopped, unwilling to voice what she had begun to feel for him. Astrid, please, let me explain. But she was already moving toward the window, looking down at the harbour where an elegant ship rode at anchor. Even from this distance, she could see the fine lines of its construction, the quality that spoke of serious wealth. On the dock stood 3 figures, 2 men in rich cloaks, and a woman whose bearing suggested noble birth. They've come for you, she said flatly. Yes, to take you back to your real life. Halrik moved closer, his voice urgent. My real life is here, with you. That other life, I left it for a reason. Before Astrid could respond, another knock came at her door. This time it was formal, measured, carrying the authority of those accustomed to being obeyed. Halrik straightened, his entire demeanor shifting into something she had never seen before. Gone was the gentle craftsman who had mended her window and carved her spoons. In his place stood someone who clearly knew how to command respect. Enter, he called, his voice carrying a tone of authority that made Astrid step back in surprise. The door opened to admit 2 men and a woman, all dressed in the finest woolen cloaks and wearing silver jewelry that caught the morning light. The older of the 2 men, grey-bearded and stern-faced, stepped forward with the confidence of someone used to having his words carry weight. Halrik Eriksson, he said formally, your family has need of you. Olaf. Halrik inclined his head with what appeared to be resigned recognition. I told my father I would not return. Your father is dead, the woman said quietly, and Astrid saw Halrik flinch as if struck. 6 months passed. Fever took him quickly. The grief that crossed Halrik's features was genuine and raw. Whatever his reasons for leaving his family, Astrid realized, love for his father had not been among them. I grieve for his passing, Halrik said carefully. But that does not change my position. It changes everything, Olaf replied. You are now head of the Eriksson holdings. Your brother, he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. Your brother has proven unsuited to the responsibility. The family business requires your attention. And the marriage contract your father negotiated still stands, the woman added, her voice gentle but implacable. The Bjornsson family expects the union to proceed as planned. Marriage contract. The words fell into the silence of Astrid's kitchen like stones into still water, sending ripples of understanding through her mind. She looked at the woman, truly looked at her for the first time, and saw someone perhaps 30 years of age, beautiful in the pale, ethereal way of northern nobility, with golden hair and blue eyes that spoke of good breeding and careful upbringing. This is Sigrid Bjornsdottir, Olaf continued, gesturing to the woman. You're betrothed. Astrid felt the world tilt around her. Betrothed? Of course. A man of Halrik's station would have obligations, arrangements made for political and economic advantage. What had she been thinking? That a nobleman would abandon his birthright for a widowed cook in a village so small it barely appeared on maps? "I see," she said quietly, her voice carefully controlled. "You have business to discuss. I should leave you to it." "Astrid, no." Halrik turned toward her, his expression desperate. "This, not what I want. What any of us want is irrelevant." Sigrid spoke for the first time, her voice cultured and precise. "There are obligations that transcend personal preference. Surely you understand this." The words were not unkind, but they carried the casual dismissiveness of someone who had never questioned that duty came before desire. Astrid looked at this beautiful, well-bred woman, who represented everything she was not: young, noble, appropriate, and felt something inside her chest crack apart. "Of course," she managed, "duty must come first." She moved toward the door, needing air, needing space, needing to process this shattering of everything she had begun to hope for. But Halrik caught her arm gently, his touch desperate. "Don't leave," he said quietly. "Please, let me handle this." "Handle this," she repeated, looking between him and his betrothed. "This is your life, Halrik, your real life. The one you ran from, but that has finally caught up with you." "Astrid." "No." She pulled free of his grasp, straightening her shoulders with what dignity she could muster. "These people have traveled far to find you. They deserve your attention, not mine." She left her own cottage then, stepping out into the cold morning air that felt like a slap after the warmth of her kitchen. Behind her, she could hear the low murmur of voices as serious matters were discussed: inheritance, responsibility, marriage contracts between families she had never heard of until this moment. Walking blindly through her village, Astrid found herself at the harbour, staring out at the elegant ship that had brought reality crashing back into her life. The vessel was beautiful, clearly built for both speed and comfort, with carved figureheads and brass fittings that gleamed in the morning sun. It represented a world she had never been part of, could never be part of. "He's been good to you, hasn't he?" a voice said behind her. Astrid turned to find Sigrid Bjornsdottir standing a few paces away, her fine cloak wrapped against the morning chill. Up close, she was even more beautiful, with the kind of ethereal loveliness that poets wrote about. "I beg your pardon?" "Halrik. During his time here, he's been kind to you." There was no malice in the question, only a genuine curiosity that somehow made everything worse. "He has been a good guest," Astrid replied carefully. Sigrid nodded slowly. "He has always been kind. Even as a boy, he could not bear to see anything suffer." She paused, studying Astrid's face with intelligent eyes. "He cares for you." The simple statement hung between them like an accusation. "He has obligations," Astrid said finally. "As do you." "Yes," Sigrid agreed quietly. "We both do." They stood in silence, watching the morning activity of the harbour, two women bound by their connection to the same man, but separated by everything else: age, station, circumstance. Finally, Sigrid spoke again. "I wanted to see the place that gave him peace," she said, "to understand what it was that made him want to stop running." Astrid looked at this young woman, who should have been her rival, but who spoke with such gentle understanding, and felt her carefully constructed composure begin to crumble. "And now you have seen it." "Yes," Sigrid said softly. "Now I have." When Astrid returned to her cottage an hour later, she found it transformed. The simple wooden table, where she and Halrik had shared so many quiet meals, now displayed papers bearing official seals, maps of trading routes, and documents that spoke of wealth and responsibility beyond her comprehension. Halrik stood hunched over these papers like a man bearing a great weight, while Olaf pointed to various figures and Sigrid sat quietly in what had been Astrid's chair by the fire. "The Bergen warehouse alone represents 2 years of revenue," Olaf was saying as Astrid entered. "Without proper oversight, we've already lost 3 major contracts to the Anderson clan. Your brother's attempts at leadership have been catastrophic," Halrik finished grimly. Yes, I understand the situation. No one acknowledged Astrid's return immediately, and she felt like a stranger in her own home. She moved quietly to her kitchen area, mechanically beginning preparations for the midday meal that had become such a natural part of their routine. Her hands worked without conscious thought, but her mind reeled with the implications of everything she had learned. "The Bjornsson alliance is crucial," Sigrid said quietly, her voice carrying the authority of someone raised to understand political necessities. "My father controls the northern shipping routes. Without that partnership, the Eriksson holdings cannot survive." "I am aware of the strategic importance," Halrik replied, but there was a hollowness in his voice that made Astrid's chest tighten. "Are you?" Olaf pressed. "Because your disappearance has already cost us dearly. The other families whisper that the Erikssons cannot be trusted to honor their commitments. Your marriage to Sigrid would restore that trust." Astrid's hands stilled on the bread she was slicing. Marriage. The word hung in the air like a death sentence for everything she had begun to hope for. "The ceremony could take place within the month," Sigrid added. "My father has already made the arrangements. We could be wed in Bergen, with representatives from all the major trading families in attendance." "How efficient," Halrik said, and Astrid heard bitter resignation in his tone. She set down her knife and turned to face the group. "Perhaps you would prefer to conduct this business elsewhere. I'm sure the inn could provide—" "No," Halrik's voice cut across her offer with sharp authority. "This is still your home, Astrid. I will not have you driven from it." The firmness in his tone seemed to surprise his visitors. Olaf raised an eyebrow, while Sigrid studied Halrik with new attention. "Of course," Sigrid said graciously, "we are guests here. Forgive us for presuming." Her courtesy only made Astrid feel worse. It would have been easier if the woman had been cruel or condescending. Instead, Sigrid Bjornsdottir was everything a nobleman's wife should be: beautiful, well-bred, politically astute, and possessed of the kind of natural grace that made her appropriate in any setting. "You are welcome," Astrid managed. "All of you. I'll prepare food for your journey back to—" "We sail tomorrow evening," Olaf announced. That should give Halrik time to settle his affairs here. Settle his affairs, as if everything that had grown between them could be reduced to a simple business transaction. The rest of the day passed in a blur of formal discussions and careful politeness. Astrid found herself relegated to the role of hostess, providing meals and ensuring her guests' comfort, while the three nobles planned Halrik's return to a life she could never be part of. She moved through her own cottage like a ghost, performing familiar tasks while her heart slowly broke apart. As evening approached, Olaf and Sigrid departed for the inn, leaving Halrik alone with Astrid for the first time since the morning's revelations. The silence between them felt heavy with unspoken words and shattered dreams. "You could have told me," Astrid said finally, not looking at him as she cleared the remains of their evening meal. "I wanted to, so many times." His voice carried a weariness that seemed to age him before her eyes. "But I knew that if you learned who I truly was, you would push me away, as I should have done." "Why?" He moved closer, his presence as overwhelming as ever. "Because I was born to wealth? Because my family has expectations? None of that changes who I am when I'm with you." Astrid finally turned to face him, seeing the pain in his eyes but steeling herself against it. "It changes everything. You are not a wandering trader, Halrik. You are Halrik Eriksson, heir to a trading empire, betrothed to a woman who can give you the life you were born to live. I don't want that life. What you want is irrelevant." She threw his family's words back at him. "You have obligations. People depend on you. Sigrid deserves better than a husband who wishes he were somewhere else." "And what about what you deserve?" he asked quietly. The question caught her off guard. "I deserve nothing more than what I have had: a good life, honestly lived." "You deserve to be loved completely, without reservation." He stepped closer, his voice growing urgent. "You deserve someone who sees your worth, who values your strength, who finds peace in your presence. You deserve—" "I deserve honesty," she interrupted. which you have not given me." The words hit him like a physical blow. "Astrid, no more." She turned away, unable to bear the intensity in his eyes. "You will return to your family, marry Sigrid, and fulfill your responsibilities. It is the right thing to do." "The right thing?" He laughed bitterly. "The right thing is marrying a woman I do not love to preserve business contracts I never wanted. The right thing is not abandoning people who depend on you for the sake of—" She paused, unable to finish the sentence. For the sake of what? Love. The word hung between them like a challenge. Neither of them had spoken it before, though it had been growing in the silence of their shared evenings and the warmth of their daily routines. "Love is a luxury," Astrid said finally. "Something for young people with no responsibilities. We are past such foolishness." "Are we?" He moved around the table, forcing her to face him. "Tell me you feel nothing for me, Astrid. Tell me these past weeks have meant nothing to you, and I will leave tomorrow without another word." The challenge in his voice terrified her, because she couldn't tell him that. Couldn't lie about the way her heart raced when he looked at her. The way she had begun to imagine a future with him, the way his departure would leave her cottage, her life emptier than it had ever been. Instead, she moved to her kitchen and began assembling ingredients with mechanical precision. "I'm going to prepare something special for tomorrow evening," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "A farewell feast, something worthy of the time we've shared." Halrik watched her for a long moment, and she could feel his gaze like a physical weight. Finally, he spoke. "What will you prepare?" "Everything I do best. Bread with honey and herbs, the stew that takes all day to perfect, honey cakes, roasted fowl with winter vegetables." Her voice grew stronger as she fell into the familiar rhythm of planning. It will be a proper farewell." "A farewell feast," he repeated quietly. "Yes." She finally looked at him, her chin raised with hard-won dignity. "For the time we've had, which has been good, and for the future you must embrace, which will be what it should be." Something shifted in his expression then, a resolve hardening in his blue eyes. "Very well, a farewell feast it shall be." That night, Astrid lay in her bed, listening to the familiar sounds of Halrik moving around her cottage, knowing they would be the last such sounds she would hear. Tomorrow he would sail away with his betrothed, return to his responsibilities, and become the man his birth required him to be. And she would remain here, in her cottage by the fjord, with her bread and her solitude, and her memories of what might have been. But first, there would be one final meal. One last gift. She could give him the full extent of her skill, the complete expression of everything she was and everything she had to offer. It would have to be enough. It would have to be enough. The morning of departure dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline light that made the fjords sparkle like scattered diamonds. Astrid had risen, before dawn, to begin her preparations. And by the time Halrik emerged from his sleep by the fire, her cottage was already filled with the aromas of baking bread and simmering stews. She worked with the focused intensity of someone who knew this would be her last chance to express everything she could not say aloud. Every loaf was shaped with extra care, every spice measured with precise attention, every dish prepared as if it might carry the weight of all her unspoken feelings. Halrik watched her from his place by the fire, neither of them speaking of what this day would bring. Instead, they moved around each other with the practiced ease of their shared weeks, but underneath the familiar rhythm lay a tension that made every gesture feel weighted with significance. By midday, word had spread through the village that Astrid was preparing a special feast. One by one, neighbors began arriving not by invitation, but drawn by the understanding that something important was happening. Old Henrik came first, settling into his usual chair with the proprietary air of someone who had claimed the right to witness whatever was about to unfold. "Smells like you're cooking for half the kingdom," he observed, watching Astrid arrange golden loaves on her great oak table. She paused, searching for words. "I wanted it to be memorable." Ingrid Hansen arrived next, bringing her two youngest children, who immediately gravitated toward the warmth of the kitchen fire. Eric the fisherman followed, then the baker's wife, then families Astrid had fed during lean times and celebrations alike. Without any formal gathering being called, her cottage began to fill with the people who had formed the heart of her world for 63 years. Sigrid and Olaf arrived as the afternoon sun reached its peak, their fine clothes and noble bearing creating a striking contrast to the village folk who had already claimed places at Astrid's table. But rather than standing apart, Sigrid moved with surprising grace among the villagers, accepting their curiosity with patient kindness and showing genuine interest in their stories. "Your village is beautiful," she told Astrid, helping to arrange platters on the laden table. "I understand now why Halrik found peace here." The comment was offered without malice, but it cut deep nonetheless. Astrid focused on the final preparations, unwilling to engage in conversation that might crack her carefully maintained composure. As evening approached and the last of the dishes were set upon the table, an expectant hush fell over the gathering. The cottage had never held so many people, yet somehow everyone had found a place. Fishermen sat beside noble visitors, children perched on makeshift stools, and the elderly claimed the chairs closest to the fire. Halrik stood slowly, his presence commanding attention even in the crowded space. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of his birth, but also a gravity that silenced even the youngest children. "Friends," he began, his gaze sweeping across the assembled faces before settling on Astrid. "We gather tonight to honor something precious, the hospitality that has been shown to a stranger, the warmth that has been shared without expectation of return." Astrid felt heat rise in her cheeks, uncertain where his words were leading. "I came to this village as a traveler seeking shelter from a storm," Halrik continued. "I found much more than refuge. I found—" He paused, and the weight of his unfinished sentence seemed to fill the room. "I found home." A murmur ran through the gathering, and Astrid saw several of the village women exchange meaningful glances. Old Henrik nodded as if this confirmed what he had long suspected. "But home," Halrik said, his voice growing stronger, "is not a place. It is not walls and roof and hearth, though these things matter. Home is found in the presence of those who see your true self and choose to welcome it anyway." Olaf shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly recognizing the direction of Halrik's speech. Sigrid, however, listened with an expression of thoughtful attention, as if she were watching something she had expected to unfold. "I have been reminded today of obligations and expectations," Halrik continued, pulling something from his belt, the smooth river stone that Astrid recognized as one Magnus had found years ago and given to her during their courtship. She had not seen it in years, had forgotten she still possessed it until this moment when Halrik held it up for all to see. "This belonged to Magnus," he said quietly, "Astrid's late husband. She told me once that he gave it to her as a promise that true love, like the stone shaped by patient water, grows more beautiful with time and pressure." Astrid's breath caught in her throat. When had she told him that story? When had he taken the stone? And why? "Magnus was a wise man," Halrik said, his eyes finding hers across the crowded room. "He understood that love is not about deserving, but about choosing. About recognizing worth that others might overlook, about having the courage to claim happiness when it is offered." The silence in the cottage was absolute now, everyone understanding that they were witnessing something more significant than a simple farewell dinner. "Astrid," Halrik said, his voice carrying clearly through the stillness, "you have told me you are too fat to love. I tell you now, before all these witnesses, that you are wrong." The words hung in the air like a challenge to everything Astrid had ever believed about herself. She stood frozen beside her laden table, acutely aware of every eye in the cottage focused on her, of Halrik's unwavering gaze, of the way her heart hammered against her ribs. "You are not too old for love," Halrik continued, stepping closer. You are not too set in your ways, too comfortable in solitude, too anything that would make you unworthy of devotion. You are a woman of strength and grace, of wisdom and kindness, of beauty that has nothing to do with youth and everything to do with character. Halrik, Olaf said sharply, rising from his seat, you forget yourself. Your obligations, my obligations, Halrik interrupted without taking his eyes from Astrid, are to live with honor. And there is no honor in abandoning the woman I love for the sake of business contracts. The word love fell into the silence like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shock through the gathered crowd. Astrid felt her knees weaken, felt the careful composure she had maintained begin to crumble. You don't know what you're saying, she whispered. I know exactly what I'm saying. He moved closer still, holding Magnus's stone out to her. I'm saying that I choose you, Astrid. I choose this life, this cottage, this village, this love that has grown between us. I choose you, and I'm asking no. I'm begging for you to choose me in return. But your family, your responsibilities, will survive without me. My brother may have made mistakes, but he can learn. The business will adapt. But this, he gestured between them, then around the cottage filled with villagers who had become his community. This cannot be replaced. Sigrid rose gracefully from her seat, her movement drawing every eye. When she spoke, her voice was clear and calm, cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. He's right, she said simply. Olaf turned toward her in shock. Sigrid, you cannot possibly. I can and I do. She moved to stand beside Halrik, but her attention was focused on Astrid. I have watched him these past 2 days, seen how he looks at you, how he speaks of this place. I have also watched you, seen how you care for him, how you've tried to sacrifice your own happiness for what you believe is right. She paused, her intelligent eyes holding Astrid's. I was raised to understand duty, to honor obligations, to put family needs above personal desires. But I was also raised to recognize love when I see it. And what I see here is love in its truest form, not the passion of youth, but the deep, abiding connection between two souls who have found their home in each other. The marriage contract, Olaf began desperately. Can be dissolved, Sigrid said firmly. My father is a practical man. He wanted alliance with the Eriksson family, but there are other ways to achieve that goal. Trade agreements, partnerships that don't require the sacrifice of two people's happiness for the sake of convenience. She turned to face Halrik directly. You would truly give up everything for her? Everything I was born to? Yes, but I would not be giving up everything. I would be choosing everything that matters. Astrid found her voice at last, though it came out as barely a whisper. I am 63 years old, and I am 53, Halrik replied. What of it? I am set in my ways, comfortable with my routines, which I have come to cherish as much as you do. I am not beautiful, not young, not anything that a man of your station should want. You are everything I want, he said with such fierce certainty that several of the village women dabbed at their eyes with their aprons. You are the peace I never knew I was seeking, the home I never thought I would find, the love I never believed I deserved. He knelt then, there in front of her neighbors and his betrothed, and the man who had come to drag him back to his old life. Kneeling on the wooden floor of her cottage, this giant of a man made himself small and vulnerable as he held out Magnus's stone like an offering. Marry me, Astrid, he said simply. Not because it makes sense to anyone else, not because it fits their expectations or serves their purposes, but because we have found something rare and precious together. Marry me because life is short and unpredictable, and we have been given a gift that it would be foolish to refuse. The cottage held its collective breath. Even the children had fallen silent, sensing the magnitude of the moment. Astrid looked down at this man who had come to her as a stranger and stayed to become what? Her salvation? Her second chance? Her unexpected miracle? She looked around the room at faces she had known for decades, saw understanding and encouragement in their expressions. These people had watched her grieve, Magnus, watched her build a life of service and solitude, watched her begin to bloom again under Halrik's patient care. "Yes," she whispered, and then, stronger, "Yes." The cottage erupted in celebration as Halrik rose and pulled her into his arms, as neighbours cheered and children clapped, as even Olaf managed a grudging smile. And in the centre of it all, Astrid felt herself transformed not into someone younger or different, but into someone who had finally learned to see herself as worthy of love. 1 year later, Astrid woke to the sound of voices drifting through her cottage windows, not the lonely silence that had greeted her mornings for so many years, but the cheerful bustle of a community preparing for celebration. Today marked the first anniversary of her marriage to Halrik, and it seemed the entire village had decided to mark the occasion with the kind of spontaneous festivity that made Skirgård feel more like an extended family than a collection of neighbours. She stretched beneath the warm wool blankets, marvelling again at how natural it felt to share her bed with someone whose presence brought comfort rather than intrusion. Halrik still rose before dawn out of old habit, but now he did so to tend their expanded hearth, a beautiful stone construction that could accommodate the larger meals they regularly prepared for friends, family, and the steady stream of visitors who had discovered that the Eriksson cottage had become an unofficial gathering place for travellers and locals alike. The new hearthstone dominated the main room now, a massive piece of granite that Halrik had selected and installed with the help of half the village men. It could hold twice as many pots as her old fireplace, with built-in bread ovens on both sides and a warming shelf that kept food at perfect temperature for hours. But more than its practical benefits, the hearth represented something profound, a home built to nurture not just two people, but a community. "Good morning, wife," Halrik said as she emerged from their bedchamber, his voice holding the same note of wonder it had carried every morning since their wedding. He stood before the great hearth, stirring something that smelled of cinnamon and honey, his massive frame somehow perfectly suited to the domestic task. "Good morning, husband," she replied, the words still sending a small thrill through her chest. At 64, she had discovered that joy could still surprise her, that happiness was not limited to the young, that love in its mature form carried depths that youthful passion could never reach. Their morning routine had evolved to accommodate both their preferences and the demands of their expanded household. Halrik would begin the day's bread while Astrid prepared their breakfast, and together they would plan the day's activities. Today's agenda included receiving Sigrid and her new husband, a Danish merchant who had proven far better suited to her temperament than Halrik ever would have been, as well as hosting Astrid's daughter Ingrid and her children, who had made the journey from their northern village. The Bjornsdottir party should arrive by midday, Halrik noted, consulting the letter that had arrived the previous week. "And your daughter sent word that they made good time on the coast road. Sigrid will want to see how we've arranged the cottage," Astrid said, feeling a flutter of pride. "I think she'll approve of what we've done." The cottage had indeed been transformed, though carefully and with respect for its original character. The main room now comfortably accommodated larger gatherings, with additional seating and a table that could be expanded to serve 20 people. The kitchen area had been reorganized to support more elaborate cooking, with new storage and work surfaces that made meal preparation a pleasure rather than a chore. But the most significant change was harder to quantify. The cottage now hummed with the energy of a place where people felt welcomed, where stories were shared, where loneliness came to be healed by the simple act of breaking bread together. As the day progressed, their guests began arriving. Sigrid came first, radiant in her happiness and clearly pleased to see how well her former betrothed had settled into his chosen life. Her new husband, Lars, proved to be a man of quiet intelligence who understood and appreciated the unusual circumstances that had brought them all together. "You've built something beautiful here," Sigrid told Astrid as they walked through the village together. "I can see why Halrik chose to stay. There's a peace here that gold cannot buy." Astrid's daughter Ingrid arrived with her children in tow, and watching Halrik interact with his step-grandchildren provided some of the day's greatest joy. The man who had once been a feared warrior displayed infinite patience as young hands helped him tend the fire, and small voices peppered him with endless questions about his travels. "You're happy, Mother," Ingrid observed, as they prepared the anniversary feast together. "Truly happy in a way I haven't seen since Father died." "I am," Astrid confirmed, surprised by how easily the admission came. "I didn't think such happiness was possible at my age." "Love doesn't follow the calendar," her daughter replied wisely. "Father would be pleased, I think. He always said you had too much love to give to spend the rest of your life alone." As evening approached and the celebration reached its peak, Astrid found herself standing in her doorway, watching the scene that had become so natural she sometimes forgot how miraculous it was. Their cottage was filled with laughter and conversation, the kind of warm community that formed around people who understood the value of simple pleasures shared with good company. Halrik appeared beside her, slipping his arm around her waist with the easy affection that had grown between them. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly. She leaned into his solid warmth, thinking of the woman she had been a year ago, convinced she was too old, too set in her ways, too unworthy of love to hope for anything more than comfortable solitude. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone who had been sleepwalking through life until circumstances forced her to wake up and discover what was still possible. "Only one," she said finally. "Oh? I regret that it took me so long to learn what you've taught me." "Which is?" She turned in his arms, looking up at the face that had become dearer to her than her own reflection. "That love is not about being young or beautiful or deserving. It's about being brave enough to accept it when it finds you, and wise enough to recognize that some gifts are too precious to refuse." Above them, the first stars of evening began to appear in the darkening sky, and inside their cottage, the warmth of home and community continued to work its quiet magic. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new opportunities to extend their circle of care to others who needed what they had learned to give. But tonight, surrounded by love in all its forms, Astrid knew she had finally learned the most important lesson of all, that it's never too late to begin again.